I'm going to begin by telling you a story that is about myself when I was in a similar position that you're in right now. And that is, I was in a graduate research course, and I was in the class at the same time that I was teaching. I was a secondary science teacher. And in this class, which was sort of the next class after the one that you're taking, it would be part 2 of the research class, we were expected to actually conduct a piece of research, an actual piece of research that we would design, conduct, and evaluate from start to finish. So as a science teacher, I was always really interested in the processes of designing good science films. It was kind of romantic for me, because when I first started teaching, we actually, believe it or not, we used film projectors. It was awesome. And we had these films that were pretty highly produced, some of them, by different agencies that were educational in nature. And I always wondered a lot when I watched my students viewing some of the films. I always wondered what thought process went into the design, and when there was a film that didn't seem to capture my students' sort of attention, or they seemed to lose focus, or didn't seem to engage in the material, what was it about the film? So I did some investigation, and I looked at different variables in filmmaking that kind of interested me. And I read a few studies that seemed pretty promising about attitudes towards things like science being influenced by students observing people their own age engaged in activities that were science related. And I remember showing a film one time in my classes that showcased this one girl who had questions about the way plants grew. And so she decided to do an experiment. And this happened to be something I was showing when I was helping my students learn about how to design experiments. And so I found this film, and I thought, you know what, I wonder, my students didn't seem to be as engaged as I thought they would be watching the film. But one thing I noticed was that the narrator was an adult female speaking in the third person. So she was referring to the girl in the film by her name and talking about her. And I think her name was Sarah. And so I wondered whether or not the film would be more engaging for my students, who were about the same age as the girl in the movie. And I wondered, would it make a difference if the narrator was the girl, and not a third-party person? So the narrator is the girl, and she's speaking in first person. That is, she's talking about herself. So I created some treatment materials, and that one showed the actual narrator, and one showed, I tried to make the production as close as possible with the girl, and I had her read the script in third person and then in first person, and I implemented it with different students, and I had hundreds of students, and I used other teachers at the time as well. So let me show you quickly just a tiny clip of the treatment materials, because I think they're interesting, and you'll have to excuse how old and low tech they are compared to like things today. But so here's the first clip that shows the original clip with the narrator, the adult narrator.
First, she picks 5 coleus plants, approximately the same size. She measures their starting height and leaf count. She will cover each plant with a different color of cellophane, similar to the colors of the spectrum. In this way, she blocks out all the colors but one. She controls the color of the light. each plant will receive only one color of light. Since Sarah is changing the variable sunlight to specific colors of sunlight, this variable becomes a manipulated variable. A manipulated variable is a variable that you introduce into the experiment.
Okay, now here's the same clip, but it has the young girl narrating it herself.
First, I pick 5 coleus plants, approximately the same size. I measure their starting height and leaf count. I will cover each plant with a different color of cellophane, similar to the colors of the spectrum. In this way, I black out all the colors but one. I control the color of the light. Each plant will receive only one color of light. Since I am changing the variable sunlight to specific colors of sunlight, this variable becomes a manipulated variable. A manipulated variable is a variable that I introduce into the experiment.
So after I randomly assigned students to different groups, and I had them view in groups the movies, and I had them record or take a kind of a test over some of the content of it, as well as attitudes about the film and attitudes about science in general. And I actually did discover when I analyzed the data that the speaking in first person was the students had paid more attention and also had higher rated, they liked it more. So it had the attitudes about the film were better when the first person narrator was speaking. So that was just the start of my thinking really scientifically about my practice as a science teacher. And in that case, my educational variables of interest, I was interested in factors that might influence engagement with a movie or a film, and also factors that, and what did it impact? Impact recall of information, application of information, and just as important, attitudes about the presentation itself and about science. And so that is something, even though you're not going to be doing research in this class, in this one, you're not going to design your own study, I'm still going to encourage you to focus on variables that are of interest to you as we work through this course.